When a routine traffic stop evolves into a pivotal moment in a police officer's career, preconceived notions clash with an unforeseen truth. The man he stops holds the power to influence his future. The Sacramento skyline was awash in shades of gold and amber as the sun began to set. Eric Porter was driving home after a demanding day at work, the gentle hum of his sedan and the soft background sound of the radio offering a brief respite from the city's hustle. Adjusting the air conditioning, Eric tried to shake off the stress of the day. Approaching a yellow light, he slowed down as it turned red, just as blue and red flashing lights illuminated his rearview mirror, accompanied by the sharp wail of a siren. Eric's brows furrowed slightly as he pulled over to the curb, lowering his window while the police cruiser stopped behind him. Out stepped Officer Bradley Larson, a man in his mid-30s with a buzz cut and a badge gleaming on his chest. Adjusting his belt, Larson approached the car with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "License and registration," he demanded curtly, his tone firm yet tinged with authority. Eric silently complied, retrieving his documents from the glove compartment and handing them over. Although his movements were calm and deliberate, he was acutely aware of Larson's watchful gaze, as if searching for a deeper reason to escalate the situation. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, leaning closer to the window. "Not entirely," Eric responded politely, his tone steady yet firm. "You didn't come to a complete stop at the light," Larson replied, though a faint hesitation betrayed his voice. Eric frowned slightly but nodded. "I see. I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Larson remained silent for a moment, studying Eric intently. The stop no longer felt routine, at least not for Larson. His demeanor shifted subtly, suggesting he'd decided this was more than just a minor traffic violation. Examining Eric's license, Larson asked, "You're not from around here, are you?" Eric hesitated briefly before responding. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Larson wasn't paying attention to the answer. His questions carried a sharper tone, signaling a shift from simple inquiry to suspicion. Eric's composed demeanor seemed to agitate him further. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Larson pressed. "Just heading home," Eric replied evenly, though the growing tension in the air was unmistakable. Larson no longer saw Eric as just a driver. He saw something that made him wary. Eric remained calm, his steady exterior a display of control rather than ignorance. Larson, unaware of this, took a deliberate step back, folding Eric's documents slowly before tucking them into his chest pocket. He straightened up, his expression tinged with smugness, as if he'd already formed a judgment about the man before him. "Step out of the car," Larson ordered. Eric's hands gripped the steering wheel briefly, though his face remained impassive. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked evenly. Larson's lips twitched, but he quickly masked it. "I said step out of the car. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The implied threat was clear. Eric let out a slow breath, opened the door, and stepped out. Larson's eyes scanned him, assessing. Eric's broad shoulders and slightly taller frame contrasted with his calm, professional appearance, marked by his tailored suit. This was only the beginning. Eric's polished shoes hinted at someone who was meticulous and deliberate, but that detail seemed irrelevant to Officer Larson. He motioned toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them." Eric complied, his movements measured and unhurried. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" he asked. Larson smirked faintly. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. Can't be too careful." Eric turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Larson. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans. Or is there another reason?" The pointed question landed heavily, briefly disrupting Larson's composure. He straightened, his hand instinctively drifting toward his belt. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice now sharper. "I'm just asking a question," Eric replied evenly, his tone calm yet firm. an approach that seemed to unnerve Larson. The officer leaned in closer, narrowing his eyes. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works. Got something to hide?" Eric let the silence linger for a moment before responding. "No, officer. I just believe interactions like this should have clear reasons. Transparency, you know?" Larson scoffed but didn't respond, pacing in a tight circle near the car. Something about the situation felt off balance. Eric wasn't behaving the way Larson expected. There was no visible fear, no stammering or nervous gestures. Instead, Eric's composure exuded confidence and control, which only heightened Larson's unease. "You seem pretty confident," Larson muttered, almost to himself. "Like you think you know how this is going to end." Eric didn't take the bait. Tilting his head slightly, he replied, "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." Larson froze for a moment, his smirk replaced by something sharper and more defensive. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Eric's calm demeanor was throwing him off, and he didn't like it. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension, and Larson began to realize this wasn't unfolding as he'd anticipated. But instead of de-escalating, he doubled down. Tapping his fingers against the holster on his belt, Larson's frustration became apparent. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Eric. His eyes flicked to the sedan, searching for a reason to justify his growing suspicion. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," he ordered, his voice clipped. "I need to check for weapons." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Weapons?" he echoed, his tone incredulous but measured. "Do I look like someone carrying a weapon?" Larson's jaw tightened, and his composure cracked briefly. "I'm not going to ask you again," he snapped. Eric hesitated briefly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face, before he silently complied, placing his palms flat on the hood of the car. Larson approached, his boots crunching against the asphalt, breaking the heavy silence. The officer began a quick, rough pat-down, his hands lingering unnecessarily long. This wasn't just a search, it was an assertion of control, an attempt to provoke a reaction. But Eric remained still, unflinching and composed, refusing to rise to the provocation. "You're clean," Larson muttered begrudgingly as he stepped back. The admission sounded irritated, as though he resented not finding anything to justify his suspicion. Eric turned to face him, his expression calm but his gaze sharp. "Of course I am," he said simply. "Now, officer, if you're done—" "I'm not done," Larson interrupted. Larson cut him off, his voice rising slightly as the words spilled out too quickly, betraying his struggle to maintain control. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" Eric folded his arms, his posture relaxed, despite the tension simmering between them. "I've had my share of encounters with law enforcement," he said. "Let's just say I've learned a thing or two over the years." Larson's eyes narrowed. "That's so. You a lawyer or something?" Eric smiled faintly. "Or something." The vagueness of his response only seemed to frustrate Larson more. He stepped closer, his tone dropping to a low growl. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric met Larson's gaze without flinching. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far I'm not seeing much of it here." The words lingered like a gauntlet thrown, and Larson couldn't resist picking it up. "Fairness?" "You think this is about fairness? People like you always—" He stopped abruptly, cutting himself off. The unfinished thought hung in the air like a warning shot, its meaning all too clear. Eric's expression remained steady, but the subtle shift in his posture signaled that he had caught exactly what Larson had left unsaid. "People like me?" Eric repeated, his voice quiet, but charged with significance. Larson bristled, stepping back as though realizing he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "You know what I mean," he muttered, though his tone lacked the conviction it had moments earlier. I think I do, Eric replied evenly, his calm demeanor now razor-sharp, slicing through the charade. And I think we both know this stopped being about a traffic violation a while ago. Larson opened his mouth to reply but found no words. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. The dynamic had shifted, and now it was Larson who stood on shaky ground. Eric broke the charged silence, his voice steady and resolute. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Larson's brows furrowed, irritation flashing in his expression. "I don't care who you are," he retorted, though the slight crack in his voice suggested otherwise. Eric reached into his pocket slowly and deliberately. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said calmly, his eyes on Larson's hand, which twitched near his holster. "No need for dramatics. I want you to see it." The moment hung heavy with unspoken tension as Eric pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming badge. "Eric Porter," he said, his tone as casual as if introducing himself at a neighborhood barbecue. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." Larson froze. His eyes darted from the badge to Eric's face, searching for some hint of humor or deceit. But Eric's expression held neither, just quiet authority and a trace of disappointment. "Internal Affairs," Larson echoed, his voice cracking slightly. "You're—" "Yes," Eric cut in, saving him the trouble of finishing. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to make sure the people wearing this badge uphold the integrity and values it stands for." Larson's face drained of color, his confidence unraveling as the weight of the revelation sank in. He took a step back, his hand falling away from his belt as though his authority had suddenly grown too heavy to bear. Eric took a step forward, narrowing the gap Larson had instinctively tried to create. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larson?" Eric asked, his voice calm yet cutting. Larson didn't respond. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd stumbled into quicksand with no way out. "It's not the profiling," Eric continued, his tone steady but firm. "Though that's bad enough. It's not even the unwarranted escalation. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even knowing who you were dealing with. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're supposed to uphold. And why?" Larson opened his mouth, but no words came out. Eric's gaze remained fixed on him, unwavering. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone worthy of respect," Eric finished for him. His voice wasn't raised, but the weight of his words landed like a gavel. "And that's not just a problem for me, officer. It's a problem for every single person you interact with while wearing that uniform." Larson's shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of Eric's pointed critique. His eyes flicked toward the badge in Eric's hand, as though wishing it would vanish if he didn't look directly at it. Eric stepped back, allowing Larson a moment to collect himself, though his tone remained firm. "Here's what's going to happen," Eric said. "You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and carefully consider what you say next." Larson hesitated, his lips parting as if to respond, but he faltered, visibly torn between defiance and compliance. His hesitation didn't go unnoticed. Eric leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a lower, more authoritative tone. "And then, Officer Larson, you're going to hear from me again, not as the driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man responsible for determining whether you're fit to wear that badge." The color drained from Larson's face as the gravity of Eric's words sank in. His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his chest pocket and retrieved Eric's license and registration. He extended them toward Eric, his confidence visibly shaken. Eric accepted the documents without a word, sliding them back into his wallet. As he turned to the driver's side door, his hand resting on the handle, he paused and looked over his shoulder. Meeting Larson's gaze one final time, he said, "Remember this, Officer Larson. The badge doesn't make you better than anyone else. It makes you accountable to everyone." Eric slid into his car and started the engine. As he pulled away, Larson stood motionless in the dimming light, his once assured demeanor thoroughly dismantled, his future hanging in the balance. For Eric, however, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The weight of the encounter lingered not because it was extraordinary, but precisely because it wasn't. Larson wasn't the first officer Eric had faced like this, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time, Eric vowed, the outcome would be different. This time, Eric had the authority to act. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk, early sunlight streaming through the blinds of his office at the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. A file lay open in front of him. Officer Bradley Larson. His record wasn't spotless. Minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, and vague misunderstandings that had never been properly addressed. Eric leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered the broader implications. Larson wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a deeper problem, and Eric wasn't interested in putting a bandage on a bullet wound. A knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Linda, stepped in, holding a stack of reports. "Good morning, Mr. Porter. I've got the summary of last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels asked me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, taking the files from her. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda hesitated, sensing the weight in Eric's tone. "Of course," she said, before slipping out of the room. Eric turned his attention back to Larson's file, but his focus wasn't just on the officer. This was bigger than one man and one interaction. It was about the culture that allowed someone like Larson to feel justified in his behavior. And if there was one thing Eric knew, it was that culture started at the top. Later that afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a conference room. Daniels, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned back in his chair, listening intently as Eric recounted the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Eric said, his voice steady but resolute. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Daniels rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up," he admitted. "But we've always handled it internally, quietly." "And that's the problem," Eric replied. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud." Daniel studied him, the weight of the conversation etched into his face. "What are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," Eric said without hesitation. "Not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." "Good," Eric said simply. "It's about time someone did." The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and reports. Eric worked tirelessly, compiling data, speaking with officers, and holding public forums to hear directly from the community. The Larson incident became a catalyst for change, a turning point that forced the department to confront its flaws head-on. Larson, for his part, faced an internal hearing. Eric made no secret of his involvement, sitting across from Larson during the proceedings and watching as the officer squirmed under the scrutiny. The hearing resulted in a suspension, but Eric knew the real victory wasn't in punishing Larson. It was in preventing the next Larson. Months later, Eric stood at the podium of a community event, addressing a room filled with officers, city officials, and local residents. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, a mixture of skepticism and hope. Eric adjusted the microphone, his gaze steady as he scanned the audience. He spoke not of blame, but of responsibility, of the shared duty to create a system that worked for everyone. His words weren't just a call for accountability, they were a promise of change. Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys, Eric said, his voice firm yet empathetic, resonating through the hall. It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. That's the badge I believe in, and that's the badge we're building here together. The room erupted into thunderous applause. Some clapped enthusiastically, while others joined more hesitantly. But for Eric, it wasn't about the applause. It was about the message. For him, this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a better one. As Eric stepped down from the podium, he glanced at the faces in the crowd. Some were skeptical, their brows furrowed with doubt. Others were hopeful, their eyes bright with the possibility of a new chapter. But they were all listening, and that was a start. He knew change wouldn't come overnight. It would take time, effort, and no shortage of difficult conversations. But change would come, and for now, that was enough. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's start the conversations that matter, the ones that lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we're capable of when we stand for what's right.